In 1885, William James attended a séance. He went not as a true believer and not as a debunker, but as an empiricist, someone committed to following evidence wherever it led, even when it led somewhere that made his colleagues uncomfortable. What he encountered that day was a medium named Leonora Piper, a Boston woman of no particular education who, in a trance state, produced information she had no obvious way of knowing information about the private lives of sitters who had come to her without any prior contact. James was not immediately convinced of anything supernatural, but he was convinced that something genuinely strange was happening that deserved sustained, careful investigation. He studied Piper for years. He sent anonymous sitters, varied conditions, and attempted every control he could devise. His conclusion was not that Piper was a fraud. He found the fraud hypothesis less credible than most of his colleagues assumed, but that she presented a genuine problem for materialist psychology. Something was happening that the standard theories of mind could not explain. What that something was, James refused to say definitively. He held the question open for decades. His engagement with psychical research was not a late eccentricity or a failure of rigor. It was a direct extension of the methodological commitments he had articulated throughout his career. James was a radical empiricist. He believed that any genuine human experience was evidence that philosophy must account for, and that dismissing entire categories of experience simply because they failed to fit within the accepted framework of science was a form of intellectual cowardice. The mystical experiences he catalogued in the varieties of religious experience, the anomalous phenomena reported to the Society for Psychical Research, the cases of what appeared to be telepathy or clairvoyance, all of these were data. They might ultimately have mundane explanations, but they had to be investigated, not dismissed. James co-founded the American Society for Psychical Research in 1885 and remained active in it until his death. He was one of the Society's most scientifically credible members, which was precisely why the scientific establishment found his involvement so irritating. A professor of psychology at Harvard who took mediums seriously was an embarrassment to colleagues working hard to establish psychology's legitimacy as a rigorous empirical science. James understood this tension perfectly well and refused to be governed by it. The pressure to conform to the boundaries of legitimate science struck him as a form of the same dogmatism he criticized in religion. He was also motivated by a deeper philosophical suspicion that the materialist picture of mind, the view that consciousness is entirely produced by brain processes and that nothing happens in or to consciousness that is not explicable in physical terms, had been elevated from a working hypothesis to an untestable dogma. He did not know that the materialist hypothesis was wrong, but he noticed that many of his colleagues treated it as though its truth had been established, when in fact it was simply the default assumption of scientific culture. Genuine empiricism required holding it as a hypothesis and taking seriously any evidence that might complicate it. His most famous statement on psychical research came in an address to the Society for Psychical Research in 1896. He argued that if you want to disprove the claim that all crows are black, you do not need to show that no crows are black. You only need to find one white crow. He thought Leonora Piper might be that white crow, not proof that the supernatural was real, but proof that the neat, tidy materialist picture of mind was insufficient. He was never certain, but he thought the question deserved a better answer than the orthodox scientific culture of his era was prepared to give it. James was also struck by the sheer quantity of testimony that had accumulated about psychical phenomena. Hundreds of educated, sober, non-hysterical people had reported experiences of apparent telepathy, of veridical dreams, of apparitions at the moment of a distant person's death that did not fit comfortably within ordinary psychological categories. A rigorous empiricist could not simply ignore this mass of evidence because it was inconvenient. He had to account for it. Either the testimony was systematically unreliable, or something genuinely anomalous was occurring. James was not sure which, and he thought the uncertainty itself was philosophically important. Modern science has not validated the specific claims that interested James. There is no robust evidence for telepathy, and the phenomena reported to the SPR have mostly yielded to conventional explanations. But James's methodological instinct that consciousness remains deeply mysterious, that the materialist account may be radically incomplete, and that intellectual humility requires keeping genuine questions open, has held up better than the confident dismissals of his critics. The hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved. The relationship between mind and brain remains genuinely puzzling. James was right that certainty was premature, even if the specific phenomena he investigated did not deliver the answers he hoped for. What his engagement with psychical research reveals, ultimately, is the character of his intellectual life, his willingness to follow a question wherever it led, his refusal to let social pressure determine the boundaries of legitimate inquiry, and his deep conviction that a universe which included human consciousness was stranger and more capacious than any tidy scientific framework could contain. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.